Old photographs possess an undeniable, almost magical quality, don't they? They are frozen fragments of time, silent witnesses to lives long lived and eras long past. Each sepia-toned face, each carefully arranged tableau holds a whisper of a story, often lost to the relentless march of time. We gaze upon them, searching for clues, for echoes of humanity that transcend the decades, sometimes even centuries. And sometimes, just sometimes, a perfectly ordinary image will reveal something profoundly unsettling, something that rewrites everything we thought we knew about that moment, transforming sweetness into a chilling enigma. We're going to delve into one such photograph today, and seemingly innocuous image from the year 1895, a picture that at first glance appears utterly charming, radiating the simple innocence of childhood. But beneath its placid surface lies a secret, a dark current that pulls at the edges of perception, waiting to be unmasked. Meet Dr. Evelyn Reed, a historian whose passion burns brightest when unearthing the forgotten narratives woven into the very fabric of historical artifacts. Her office, a labyrinth of towering bookshelves and overflowing archival boxes, is a testament to her dedication. Sunlight filtered through dusty blinds, illuminating motes dancing in the air, a silent ballet accompanying her meticulous research. She isn't interested in the grand narratives of kings and wars. Evelyn chases the whispers of everyday life, the small, intimate moments that collectively paint the true portrait of an age. Her fingers, nimble and accustomed to the delicate touch required for brittle parchment and fragile daguerreotypes, have brought countless forgotten souls back into the light. For Evelyn, history isn't just about dates and names. It's about the beating hearts that once lived them, the triumphs and tragedies etched into the very objects they left behind. A peculiar intuition, honed over years of painstaking research, often guides her, a subtle nudge towards the overlooked detail, the anomaly that others might dismiss. It was this very intuition that drew her to the 1895 photograph. The image itself is a classic of its time, a group portrait, perhaps a family, captured in the soft, diffused light of a late afternoon. Several adults, stiff-backed and formally dressed, occupy the background, their expressions solemn, as was customary for photographs of that era. But the foreground is dominated by children, their faces a delightful contrast to the adults' gravity. A young girl, perhaps 5 or 6, clutches a delicate doll, her eyes wide with innocent curiosity. Beside her, a slightly older boy, maybe 10 years old, stands with an almost defiant confidence, his hair neatly parted, his clothes surprisingly well maintained for what appears to be a rural setting. He is the focal point, not just for his position, but for the object he holds. At first glance, it's easy to dismiss it, to assume it's a toy, a stick, or perhaps some odd trinket of the time. The overall impression is one of wholesome simplicity, a snapshot of Victorian-era childhood, quaint and heartwarming. It's a scene that evokes a nostalgic pang for a simpler time, a moment untouched by the complexities of our modern world. Evelyn initially shared this sentiment, admiring the composition, the faint smiles teasing the corners of the children's mouths, the quiet dignity of the adults. She saw a moment frozen in time, a sweet, unblemished memory. However, as Evelyn's keen eyes lingered, something began to shift. The sweet facade began to crack, subtly, almost imperceptibly. It wasn't a glitch in the photo, nor a trick of the light. It was the boy, or rather what the boy was gripping in his small, determined hand. It wasn't a stick for play nor a child's toy. The object was dark, irregularly shaped, and appeared to be fashioned from something organic. Its texture seemed rough, almost menacing, even in the grainy black and white. It was not a familiar object, not something one would expect a child to casually hold in a formal portrait. A faint chill snaked its way down Evelyn's spine, a premonition that this charming image held a deeper, more unsettling narrative. The boy's grip on the item was surprisingly firm, almost possessive, his knuckles white with the effort. And his eyes, those seemingly innocent eyes, held a depth that belied his young age, a curious intensity that seemed to acknowledge the significance of the strange item he cradled. This wasn't merely an object, it was a statement, a silent scream embedded within the otherwise serene tableau. The more she looked, the less sweet the picture became, and the more the object in the boy's hand screamed of a hidden dark truth. It transformed the entire image from a gentle memory into a compelling, urgent historical mystery begging to be unraveled. What exactly was that object? What did it represent? And why was this seemingly innocent boy holding it with such profound intent in a photograph meant to capture a moment of family tranquility? The questions piled up, each one drawing Evelyn deeper into the unsettling gaze of the boy and the bizarre item in his clenched fist. This innocent-looking 1895 photograph, with its charming children and stoic adults, had suddenly become a puzzle, a historical cold case waiting for someone like Evelyn to piece together its fragmented truths. Get ready to embark on this journey with us as we peel back the layers of time, pixel by pixel, to uncover the astonishing story behind this photograph. If you're fascinated by the hidden tales that history holds, the mysteries that lie dormant in plain sight, then make sure you subscribe to our channel right now. You won't want to miss a single revelation as we dive headfirst into this captivating enigma. Trust us, this is just the beginning of a story far more complex and captivating than anything you could possibly imagine. Evelyn, driven by an insatiable curiosity that had defined her entire academic career, began her meticulous examination of the 1895 photograph. Her gaze, usually so quick to discern patterns and anomalies, lingered on the small boy at the center. His expression, initially perceived as merely solemn, now seemed to hold a subtle tension, a nascent anxiety that subtly distorted the corners of his mouth. It wasn't the natural seriousness often found in early portraiture, but something more deeply rooted, a reflection of an internal state that contradicted the otherwise placid scene. The true focal point, however, remained the object clutched in his small hand. It was indistinct, almost a blur in the sepia tones, yet undeniably present. Its outline was curved, slender, and seemed to possess a delicate, almost skeletal quality. Evelyn zoomed in, then zoomed in again, pushing the digital image to its pixelated limits, but clarity remained elusive. Her initial research into typical Victorian-era children's toys and common household items proved inconclusive. She scoured digitized catalogs from the period, examined countless museum archives displaying domestic artifacts, and delved into academic papers on childhood in the late 19th century. Nothing she found bore a definitive resemblance to the object. Its unusual shape defied easy categorization, refusing to align with the familiar dolls, hoops, or wooden animals that populated images of children from that epoch. This lack of immediate identification only deepened the mystery, transforming a mild curiosity into a consuming intellectual challenge. The more she looked, the more the object seemed to subtly shift, taking on new, unsettling interpretations in her mind. Was it a peculiar piece of jewelry, a tool, or something far stranger, an item whose purpose had been lost to the annals of time? The primary antagonist in Evelyn's quest wasn't a living person, but the relentless passage of time itself, an insidious foe that eroded memories and scattered evidence. The era from which the photograph hailed was a transitional one, a bridge between the intensely private world of handwritten records and the burgeoning yet still rudimentary public archive. Many personal histories, particularly those of ordinary families, remained undocumented or existed only in fragile, decaying physical forms. Archival records from that precise year, and more importantly, from what she suspected was a smaller, less prominent community, were frustratingly incomplete. Local newspapers might offer snippets, but their digitization was a monumental ongoing task, and many simply hadn't survived. Family histories, when she could even begin to trace them, often ended abruptly a generation or two prior to 1895, swallowed by migration, forgotten names, or the simple disinterest of subsequent descendants. It was like trying to stitch together a tapestry from threads that had long since unraveled and blown away. Undeterred by these formidable obstacles, Evelyn initiated a series of consultations. Her first call was to Dr. Alistair Finch, a renowned authority on Victorian photography, whose reputation for deciphering the minutiae of historical images was legendary. She emailed him the high-resolution scan, hoping for an immediate revelation. Dr. Finch, after a few days, responded with polite bewilderment. He acknowledged the unusual nature of the object, confessing that it didn't fit any conventional item he'd encountered in thousands of archived photographs. He suggested it might be a handmade personal item, perhaps even a grotesque, a memento mori, or something with specific localized cultural significance. His uncertainty, normally a cause for discouragement, instead fueled Evelyn's conviction that she was onto something truly unique. Next, she reached out to Professor Anneliese Dubois, a cultural historian specializing in 19th century folk practices and superstitions, particularly in rural Britain. Professor Dubois examined the image with a similar lack of recognition. While she found the overall composition and setting typical of rural family portraiture of the time, the object in the boy's hand was an anomaly. She mused about it being a charm or an amulet, but couldn't attach it to any known folk tradition she was familiar with. The lack of context, she explained, was the critical barrier. Without knowing the family's origin or the specific locale, it was impossible to connect the item to a regional belief system. Evelyn then turned her attention to local historical societies, sending queries to dozens of small towns and villages with active historical groups, hoping a volunteer might recognize something specific to their area. She described the photograph in detail, emphasizing the peculiar object, but again the responses were largely negative. A few offered guesses: a rudimentary fishing spear, a small shepherd's crook, even a broken piece of machinery. But none felt convincing. None truly matched the delicate, almost ceremonial appearance of the item. Each dead end, each expert's polite shrug, only served to deepen the enigma. The photo, initially perceived as sweet, was now shrouded in an almost palpable sense of unanswered questions, and the object held by the child, once a mere detail, had become the silent, enigmatic heart of an unfolding historical puzzle. The initial hope for a quick resolution had long faded, replaced by the grim determination of a true researcher facing a formidable, deeply entrenched mystery. The frustration became a dull ache behind Dr. Albright's eyes, a persistent shadow dogging her every waking moment. Weeks had dissolved into a blurred montage of digital archives and dusty microfiches, yet the seemingly innocuous 1895 photograph remained an impenetrable enigma. The boy, his face a childish mask of solemnity, and the object clutched in his small hand, stubbornly withheld their secrets. Conventional research methods, the well-trodden paths of historical inquiry, had yielded nothing but dead ends. She had consulted every readily available census record, mapped out potential geographical regions based on architectural styles in the background, and even cross-referenced popular children's toys and tools from the Victorian era. Each avenue led to a cul-de-sac, leaving her more perplexed than before. It was during one particularly late night, fueled by strong black coffee and sheer stubbornness, that a new approach began to form in her mind. She abandoned the broad strokes, the general inquiries, and decided to zoom in to scrutinize every pixel, every thread, every minute detail of the image. She digitally enhanced the photograph, pushing its limits, revealing textures and patterns previously invisible to the naked eye. Her gaze lingered on the faint pattern on the boy's worn jacket sleeve, a subtle, almost imperceptible geometric design. It wasn't a common print. And the slightly irregular stitching on the woman's bonnet, barely visible in the original print, hinted at homemade craftsmanship. perhaps specific to a particular community or a less affluent social stratum. Then there was the backdrop itself. While initially dismissed as generic rural landscape, the gnarled oak tree leaning precariously in the background, its distinctive branching pattern, struck her as oddly familiar. She had seen something similar in a collection of regional landscape photographs from the late 19th century. A specific region, a thought, a fragile thread began to weave itself through the labyrinth of her mind. What if the clue wasn't in the object directly, but in the environment, the subtle cultural markers embedded within the image? Driven by this nascent theory, she shifted her focus from broad national archives to highly localized, often overlooked repositories. It was a tedious, painstakingly slow process, sifting through digitized collections of small-town newspapers, community bulletins, and obscure church records that rarely saw the light of day. Most of these resources were poorly indexed, if at all, requiring her to scroll page by page, year by year, through faded typography and barely legible script. The digital equivalent of coal mining, she mused, each click a swing of the pickaxe, hoping to strike a vein of precious information. Days blurred into weeks again, but this time the frustration was tempered by a growing sense of anticipation. She was no longer just searching, she was hunting. And then, in a forgotten corner of the digital archives of the Willow Creek Gazette, a weekly publication from a remote New England village nestled between an advertisement for patent medicine and a notice about a lost pig, she found it. Not an outright explanation, not a direct reference to the photograph, but a series of cryptic, unsettling mentions from the autumn of 1895. A short article, barely 3 paragraphs long, spoke of unusual occurrences in the local woods, strange lights and disturbing sounds reported by villagers. Another, a week later, mentioned a rash of disappearances of small livestock and, more chillingly, a brief, hushed account of a young boy, about the age of the one in her photograph, who had gone missing for several days before reappearing, dazed and unresponsive, clutching a peculiar artifact. The newspaper, ever mindful of its reputation in a God-fearing community, quickly dismissed these incidents as country superstitions and overactive imaginations. But the undertone of unease was palpable. The pieces, though fragmented, began to coalesce. The gnarled oak in the photograph, the distinctive stitching, the boy's solemn demeanor. They all seemed to resonate with the hushed anxieties emanating from the Willow Creek Gazette. This wasn't merely a quaint village. This was a place steeped in a forgotten local folklore, a region where the veil between the mundane and the mysterious might have been thinner. Dr. Albright felt a jolt of adrenaline, a profound sense of breakthrough. The conventional historical narratives had failed because this wasn't a conventional story. It wasn't about politics or economics or grand societal shifts. It was about something deeper, something rooted in the soil, the whispers of a community and the fear of the unknown. The photograph was not just a window into the past, it was a key. And Willow Creek, it seemed, held the lock. She scrolled through more issues, her heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. The initial revelations were chilling, hinting at a reality far more unsettling than any mere historical curiosity. The seemingly sweet photograph was beginning to shed its innocent veneer, revealing glimmers of a darker narrative, a story waiting to be unearthed from the forgotten annals of Willow Creek. The pursuit of truth had just taken a decidedly eerie turn. The trail led Dr. Albright deeper into the history of Willow Creek, a name that now felt less idyllic and more laden with mystery. The newspaper mentions, though sparse and deliberately understated, painted a picture of a community grappling with something unsettling, something they perhaps didn't wish to acknowledge openly. Her next step was clear. Delve into the family histories and community records of Willow Creek from that specific period. She began cross-referencing names, looking for families with young boys around the age of the one in the photo, and any mention of peculiar artifacts or unexplained disappearances. It was slow, meticulous work, often yielding nothing but dead ends and fragmented genealogies. Many families had moved away, their lineage lost to time, their stories swallowed by the passage of generations. However, the digital breadcrumbs, faint as they were, eventually led her to the Barrows family. A brief obituary from 1905 for an Agnes Barrows' beloved mother listed surviving children, including a son named Thomas, born in 1887. This Thomas would have been precisely 8 years old in 1895, a perfect match for the boy in the photograph. Further digging uncovered a Willow Creek town census from 1900 which corroborated the family's residence and the ages of their children. The Barrows family, it seemed, lived on the outskirts of the village, close to the woods where the unusual occurrences had been reported. This geographical detail resonated deeply with the natural setting of the photograph, particularly the distinctive gnarled oak that seemed to loom behind the boy. With a specific family now in focus, Dr. Albright refined her search. She scoured church baptismal records, school enrollment lists, and property deeds, all digitized and painstakingly indexed by a regional historical society. The Barrows family, particularly Thomas, began to emerge from the historical haze. The newspaper mentioned a boy who returned dazed and unresponsive, clutching a peculiar artifact. Could this be Thomas? And if so, what was that object now so central to the photograph's unsettling aura? The object in the boy's hand was no longer a mere detail. It had become the nexus of the entire mystery. Its unusual appearance, the way the boy clutched it with a mixture of fear and possessiveness, suggested it was far from an innocent child's toy. It appeared organic, perhaps wood or bone, yet too intricately shaped to be natural. It possessed a crude, almost primitive quality, hinting at a purpose outside of common household items or playthings. She started researching local folklore and regional superstitions from late 19th century New England. This was a time when rural communities, isolated and deeply connected to the rhythms of nature, often held on to older beliefs, blending Christian teachings with remnants of pre-Christian magic and fear of the unknown. She looked for stories of protective charms, or conversely, objects used in malevolent practices. She explored accounts of lost children, forest spirits, and the rituals people performed to ward off perceived evils. The more she read, the more she understood that the world of 1895 Willow Creek was far removed from the rational, scientific worldview of the burgeoning industrial age. It was a world where whispers in the woods could mean something truly sinister. The object seemed to be a carved effigy of some kind, perhaps a stylized animal or a distorted human figure, its surface worn smooth in places, as if from repeated handling. It was too slender to be a doll, too angular to be a natural branch, and too specific in its contours to be an accidental piece of debris. The more she zoomed in, the more she noticed subtle details, faint etchings that seemed to form patterns, or perhaps even crude symbols, suggesting intentional craftsmanship. It wasn't just a peculiar artifact, it was an artifact imbued with meaning, a meaning that Thomas, or whoever had given it to him, understood deeply. As her understanding of Willow Creek deepened, recurring themes began to emerge, forming a tapestry of local life and hidden anxieties. Hardship was a constant companion in these isolated communities, exacerbated by harsh winters and uncertain harvests. Superstition, rather than being mere folklore, often served as a coping mechanism, a way to explain the inexplicable or to feel a modicum of control over an unpredictable world. But beneath these general themes, a more specific undercurrent started to surface. Tales of a forgotten local tragedy, something more acute than the everyday struggles, a shadow that seemed to linger in the collective memory of the region, even if it wasn't explicitly written about in official records. The sparse newspaper articles about the strange lights and disappearances now clicked into place with the emerging folklore. They weren't isolated incidents, but rather echoes of a deeper foundational fear within the community. The peculiar artifact and the boy's dazed return were not just curious anecdotes. They were almost certainly responses to or consequences of this underlying tragedy or pervasive superstition. The photograph, once a mere curiosity, was transforming into a poignant visual document, a freeze frame captured in the aftermath of something profoundly disturbing. Dr. Albright knew she was on the cusp of something significant, something that would fundamentally alter her perception of that seemingly sweet 1895 image. The threads were coming together, weaving a narrative far more complex and emotionally charged than she had initially imagined. The seemingly simple village of Willow Creek and the innocent boy at its heart were about to reveal a secret that time had tried its best to bury. The name Willow Creek echoed in Dr. Albright's mind, a quiet yet insistent whisper guiding her further into the past. The newspaper articles from 1895, dismissed by their contemporaries as mere gossip or unfounded superstition, painted a vivid, unsettling picture of a community gripped by an inexplicable fear. She pored over maps, tracing the meandering Willow Creek, identifying the location of the long-defunct newspaper office, and even finding faint traces of the village's layout from old land deeds. Her research moved from the purely archival to a more anthropological approach, seeking out local historical societies, no matter how small or unheralded, in the surrounding regions. She found a dusty handwritten ledger in the basement of the Regional Historical Society in a neighboring county, a collection of local anecdotes and oral histories compiled by a meticulous, yet largely forgotten amateur historian in the 1930s. Amongst tales of bumper harvests and harsh winters, a recurring narrative began to emerge: the shadow blight. This wasn't a disease of crops or livestock in the conventional sense, but a pervasive sense of unease, a localized phenomenon where the shadows seemed to lengthen prematurely, and a biting chill permeated the air even on the warmest days. More unsettling were the accounts of children experiencing vivid nightmares, waking with night terrors that left them disoriented and clutching at nothing. These were not isolated incidents. The ledger documented dozens of similar occurrences over a span of several years, peaking in the mid-1890s. The common thread was a specific type of protective charm, often depicted crudely in the margins of the ledger, that local families would fashion for their children. It was described as a warding knot, intricately woven from dried reeds and specific types of river stones, said to ward off the night walkers and shadow weavers that haunted the peripheral woods. A jolt ran through Dr. Albright as she stared at the crude drawing of the warding knot. The description, the materials, the purpose, it perfectly matched the strange, unsettling object clutched in the boy's hand in the photograph. The reeds, once green and pliable, now dried and brittle, the dull, dark stones incorporated into its structure. It wasn't a toy, not a trinket, and certainly not something benign. It was a talisman, a desperate plea for protection against an unseen yet deeply feared entity. The innocent-looking photo, once a perplexing anomaly, now transformed into a chilling testament to a child's silent struggle against a community's unspoken dread. The boy wasn't just holding an object. He was gripping his shield, his only defense against the creeping fear that permeated the very air of Willow Creek. The implications hit her with a profound emotional force. This wasn't just an academic puzzle anymore. This was the raw, untamed fear of a bygone era, etched into the solemn face of a child. The seemingly sweet photograph was now a window into a dark chapter of human belief, a tangible artifact of a deeply held superstition that had once dictated the lives and fears of an entire community. The historian felt a deep ache in her chest, a profound empathy for the boy who, barely old enough to understand the world, was already burdened with carrying such a weighty token of protection. The stoic expression, the tight grip. They were not merely photographic choices, but reflections of a lived, terrifying reality. She closed her eyes, the image of the boy's face superimposed on the crude drawing of the warding knot. The newspaper articles, once vague and dismissive, now resonated with horrifying clarity. The unusual occurrences, the strange lights, the disturbing sounds. These were the manifestations of the shadow blight, the fear that necessitated such an object. And the missing boy, reappearing dazed and unresponsive, clutching a peculiar artifact. It was him. The boy in the photograph was the one who had disappeared, only to return bearing the physical manifestation of the community's terror. His ordeal was captured not just in the hushed tones of old newspaper clippings, but also, far more poignantly, in the subtle details of that 1895 photograph. Dr. Albright felt the weight of history settle upon her, not as a collection of facts, but as a visceral experience. The photograph wasn't just a historical document. It was a silent scream, a frozen moment of profound vulnerability, and the desperate human need for protection against the inexplicable. The seemingly benign setting, the gnarled oak, the gentle light, now seemed to amplify the underlying tension, creating a stark contrast between external serenity and internal turmoil. The more she understood, the more the photo shed its initial innocence, revealing layers of human experience she could only now begin to truly comprehend. The boy's gaze, once simply intense, now held the distant, haunted look of someone who had peered too deeply into the shadows. The warding knot was not merely an object, it was a story, a cry suspended in time. The whispers from the Willow Creek Gazette provided the first true tremor, a ripple that began to expand, revealing the broader landscape of fear and superstition that had once enveloped that small, isolated community. Dr. Albright, her fingers trembling slightly as she navigated the faded digital pages, understood that the photograph was not merely a snapshot of a single child and his peculiar object, but a window into the collective anxieties of an entire village. The boy, whose name she still didn't know, was a focal point. Yes, but the story was far larger, encompassing the other individuals present in the frame, their somber expressions now taking on new, unsettling meaning. The woman, perhaps his mother, her hand resting protectively on his shoulder, now seemed less comforting and more a conduit of her own silent dread. The older man, his gaze distant, appeared burdened by a knowledge he dared not voice. They were all complicit, not in wrongdoing, but in a shared, unspoken acknowledgement of the pervasive darkness that shadowed their lives. Dr. Albright delved deeper into the local records, not just the newspaper, but also church registers, property deeds, and even school enrollment lists, searching for connections, for family names that might align with the faces in the photograph. The period around 1895 in Willow Creek was marked by a series of hardships that went beyond local folklore. Economic depression had hit rural communities hard, and Willow Creek, already remote, faced increased isolation. The scarcity of resources often fueled suspicion, blame, and a resurgence of older pre-Christian beliefs that lingered beneath the surface of their outwardly pious lives. Crop failures, livestock diseases, and unexplained deaths were often attributed not to natural causes, but to malevolent forces, to curses, or to the ill will of certain individuals. The line between misfortune and magical interference blurred considerably when survival was at stake. The peculiar artifact held by the boy, now understood to be an apotropaic charm, a protective device designed to ward off evil, was a stark symbol of this societal context. It wasn't simply a personal token. It was a desperate plea, a tangible manifestation of a community's fear. The nature of this fear, Dr. Albright discovered, was multifaceted. The unusual occurrences and strange lights mentioned in the Gazette hinted at a fear of the unknown, of the wilderness pressing in on their small settlement. The disappearances of small livestock and the boy's own brief vanishing pointed to a more primal dread, the vulnerability of life itself, the constant threat of loss. In such an environment, the belief in spirits, witches, or malevolent entities became not just folklore, but a coping mechanism, a way to attribute meaning to the inexplicable and to feel a semblance of control through rituals and charms. She meticulously cross-referenced local census data with the descriptions of the people in the photograph, painstakingly piecing together family trees and neighborhood connections. The community was small and tightly knit, which meant that any tragedy or unusual event would have rippled through every household. The individuals in the photo were likely not just a family unit, but representatives of a shared experience, their collective demeanor a reflection of the pervasive mood in Willow Creek during that autumn of 1895. The historical context painted a vivid picture, a community grappling with economic hardship, harsh natural elements, and a deeply ingrained spiritual landscape where superstition and faith intertwined seamlessly. This wasn't a place where people would casually dismiss an object like the one in the boy's hand. Its creation and its presence in a formal portrait suggested a serious, indeed solemn purpose. The human element of the narrative began to emerge with devastating clarity. Imagine the parents watching their children fall ill, their crops fail, their neighbors whispering tales of misfortune. What would they not do to protect their own? The decision to craft such a potent charm, to place it firmly in the hand of their child, and then to capture that moment for eternity in a photograph spoke volumes. It was an act of both profound love and abject terror. It was a desperate invocation of protection, a tangible prayer against the unseen forces they believed were besieging them. The photograph, once appearing sweet, now pulsed with the raw, visceral emotions of a community teetering on the edge of despair, clinging to any shred of hope or perceived defense against a world they barely understood and could not control. The boy, innocent and small, became the vessel for their collective dread and their enduring hope. His solemnity in the photograph was not posed. It was a reflection of the heavy atmosphere, the pervasive anxiety that even a child could not escape. He was not just holding an object. He was bearing the weight of his family's and perhaps his entire community's silent plea for deliverance. The photograph, once a stark image, was now imbued with a living, breathing history, rich with the hopes and fears of those long-gone individuals. Dr. Albright felt an overwhelming sense of connection to them, a profound empathy for their struggles. The historical context wasn't just dates and events. It was the backdrop to human suffering, resilience, and belief. The object in the boy's hand was no longer an enigma. It was a testament to the societal pressures and spiritual beliefs that defined an era, a poignant marker of the emotional landscape of Willow Creek in 1895. The narrative had expanded, drawing in the fears, the superstitions, and the desperate hopes of an entire community, all encapsulated within that single haunting image. The sweet veneer had been fully stripped away, revealing not darkness for darkness's sake, but the very real, very human struggle against forces both natural and perceived, a struggle etched onto the faces of those who looked out from the past. The true horror, the agonizing depth of the community's plight, finally laid itself bare before Dr. Albright. It wasn't merely a protective charm, it was a desperate, almost sacrificial measure taken in the face of relentless loss. Through painstaking cross-referencing of death records, local legends, and the fragmented memories passed down through generations in Willow Creek, the historian pieced together the harrowing truth. The autumn of 1895 had brought not just economic hardship, but a virulent outbreak, likely diphtheria or a severe strain of influenza that swept through the small, isolated community like a silent, invisible reaper. Children, particularly the youngest, were most vulnerable. Families watched helplessly as their little ones succumbed one after another, their tiny lives extinguished with terrifying rapidity. The air hung heavy with grief, fear, and a desperate search for answers, or failing that, a shield against the relentless onslaught. During this dreadful period, fueled by ancient fears and the desperate need for control in an uncontrollable situation, an old belief resurfaced in Willow Creek. Whispers began of a malevolent spirit, a child snatcher, thought to prey on the innocent and vulnerable, particularly during times of widespread illness. This wasn't merely local folklore, it was a deep-seated superstition rooted in centuries-old European traditions brought over by the early settlers, beliefs that gained renewed potency when faced with inexplicable tragedy. The protective charm, painstakingly crafted from a specific wood, bound with threads of human hair, and possibly consecrated with a drop of blood or a mother's tears, wasn't meant to repel illness in a purely medical sense. It was meant to physically ward off the child snatcher, to make the child undesirable or invisible to the malevolent entity. The object the boy clutched was not a symbol of hope in the abstract. It was a tangible, desperate plea to an unseen force, a desperate measure to ransom a life. The full, harrowing story materialized with overwhelming clarity. The family in the photograph had already lost a child, perhaps two, to the epidemic before this portrait was taken. The boy in the center, still so young and vulnerable, was their last hope, their surviving son. The choice to photograph him gripping the charm wasn't an artistic whim or a casual documentation of local custom. It was a defiant, desperate declaration to the universe, to God, to the child snatcher itself. This one you shall not have. The solemnity on their faces, the almost strained togetherness, now made perfect sense. It was a family teetering on the precipice of utter despair, gathering for a final, almost ritualistic act of defiance against invisible forces that had already claimed so much. The entire composition of the photograph transformed into a silent scream, a frozen prayer against further heartbreak. This was the climax of Dr. Albright's journey, the agonizing moment when the veil was finally lifted, revealing the raw, visceral pain hidden beneath a century of dust. The photo was no longer just an antique. It was a profound historical document, a testament to the extremes of human suffering and belief. It captured not a fleeting moment, but the terrifying crescendo of a community's fear and a family's desperate gamble for survival. The object in the boy's hand suddenly embodied the collective terror of a small town watching its children fade away, a potent symbol of a battle fought in the spiritual realm when earthly medicine offered little solace. The turning point was undeniable. The photograph, once merely a curiosity, now vibrated with the emotional weight of 1,000 untold stories of loss. It spoke of mothers and fathers making unimaginable choices, clinging to any shred of hope, however superstitious, in the face of overwhelming grief. It crystallized the profound vulnerability of human life in an era before modern medicine, when communities often resorted to ancient beliefs to explain and combat the inexplicable. The seemingly sweet image of a young boy became a poignant memorial, a silent cry from the past, echoing the anguish of parents who witnessed life itself being stolen from their grasp. From the boy's perspective, what could have been his experience? He was likely too young to fully comprehend the nuances of the epidemic or the ancient superstitions that gripped his elders, yet he would have felt the pervasive tension, the hushed voices, the scent of illness, and the palpable grief that hung in the air. He would have seen the tears, the worried glances. He would have felt the insistent pressure of his parents' hands placing the crafted charm firmly into his small grip, perhaps with whispered words of protection, words he might not have understood but whose urgency he would have intuitively absorbed. He would have sensed the extraordinary significance of this moment, this formal pose with his family, all eyes on him, his hand carefully positioned around the carved wood. He wasn't just holding an object, he was holding the hopes, the fears, and the very last prayers of his loved ones. His solemn expression, therefore, was not merely adolescent stoicism. It was the unburdened, unfiltered reflection of the profound emotional landscape in which he existed, a landscape painted with dread and desperate, fragile hope. His young mind, though unable to articulate the complex suffering around him, intrinsically mirrored the gravitas of the situation. He was, in that moment, the innocent bearer of his family's heart-wrenching plea against the encroaching darkness. The mystery of the 1895 photograph, once shrouded in benign obscurity, was now fully resolved, its detailed background story meticulously laid out for all to see. The boy, Samuel, gripped the dried fox paw not as a playful toy but as a potent amulet, a tangible shield against the creeping shadow of the Willow Creek blight. His family, particularly his mother, Alara, believed with an unwavering conviction that this charm, imbued with ancient folk magic, held the power to protect him from the pervasive illness that had already claimed several children in their small, isolated community. The blight, a virulent strain of diphtheria, had swept through Willow Creek with merciless efficiency, its coughs and fevers a terrifying precursor to an often fatal outcome. Fear had been a constant companion in those autumn months, a cold, insidious presence that seeped into every home, every conversation. The photograph, taken by a traveling daguerreotypist who passed through the valley that year, was not a casual family portrait, but a desperate act of faith, a visual prayer. Alara, haunted by the memory of her younger sister lost to a similar illness years prior, had sought any means, scientific or superstitious, to safeguard her children. The local doctor, overworked and under-resourced, offered little solace beyond basic sanitation advice. It was the elder women of the community, carrying traditions passed down through generations, who offered Alara the fox paw, harvested with ritualistic care from a freshly caught animal. They spoke of its protective energies, its ability to ward off sickness and malevolent spirits. For Alara, consumed by maternal terror, this was not a matter of superstition, but of survival, a final, tangible hope. Samuel, just 7 years old, understood the gravity of the charm. He had seen the empty chairs at the schoolhouse, heard the hushed whispers of grief from neighboring farms. He knew his small hand, firmly clasped around the rough, desiccated paw, was meant to hold something sacred, something powerful. His solemn expression, initially misconstrued as youthful stoicism, was in fact a poignant blend of childish earnestness and an unwitting acceptance of the heavy burden placed upon him. He was a sentinel against the unseen, a bearer of his family's desperate hope. The other figures in the photograph, his father, stern-faced and weary, his younger sister clinging to Alara's skirt, all carried the same undercurrent of anxiety, a silent acknowledgement of the crisis that gripped their lives. The image was a collective expression of a community's struggle against a relentless, invisible foe and their recourse to every possible defense, both conventional and unconventional. Dr. Albright, having meticulously pieced together this heartbreaking narrative, felt a profound sense of closure, yet also a deep emotional resonance. The initial sense of an eerie, unsettling detail had given way to a story of profound human resilience and the universal desire to protect one's loved ones against overwhelming odds. The historian reflected on the profound power of such historical photographs to encapsulate hidden stories, to freeze moments in time that, upon deeper examination, could reveal entire worlds of human experience. This image, once a curious anomaly, now stood as a testament to the harsh realities of life in the late 19th century, a time when medical science was rudimentary, and communities often turned to folk remedies and spiritual beliefs to navigate inexplicable tragedies. The responsibility of uncovering and preserving such stories weighed heavily, yet satisfyingly, upon Dr. Albright. Every faded tintype, every grainy print, held the potential for a deeper truth, a forgotten voice waiting to be heard. Samuel's photograph was no longer just an antique. It was a vibrant tapestry woven with fear, love, hope, and the raw, unadorned experience of a family facing down a plague. Its sweetness was not in its superficial innocence, but in the poignant, desperate love that drove a mother to seek protection for her child in every available form, however unconventional. The lasting impression on Dr. Albright, and hopefully on the audience, was not of horror but of empathy, a deep understanding of the human spirit's enduring struggle and its capacity for both vulnerability and courage. The journey through the archives, the dusty ledgers, the forgotten newspapers, and the quiet whispers of ancestral memory had culminated in a richer, more nuanced understanding of a single moment in time. It underscored the invaluable lesson that history is never truly black and white. It is always painted in the complex, vibrant colors of human emotion and circumstance. The seemingly simple photograph from 1895 had unfurled into an epic of survival, superstition, and unwavering familial devotion. If you found this deep dive into the hidden layers of history as captivating as we have, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more journeys into the past. We continually unearth the untold stories behind historical artifacts, bringing forgotten narratives to light. And if you're eager for another mystery, click on the video now appearing on your screen, where we investigate another seemingly innocuous object that holds a chilling secret from a bygone era. Discover the secrets that photographs keep and join us as we continue to peel back the layers of history, one fascinating image at a time.